Hello, Alex. The floor is yours.
Hello, Tonya. Hello, Tonya, and happy Independence Day to all Ukrainians. Now, here in our outdoor studio in Kyiv Street Studio in building, we're going to have a series of interviews aimed at debunking Russian myths about Ukraine. Now, I want to remind our audience that during the Revolution of Dignity back in 2014, a number of important Euromaidan events, including attacks and a tragic fire, occurred right here in that very building. That's why it's very symbolic for us to be here today for the Independence Day. Now, during our first interview, we are going to debunk the lies of common Russian propaganda about Crimea. Joining us to expand on this topic is Anton Korynevych, a permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Hello, Mr. Korynevych.
Hello, and happy Independence Day.
Happy Independence Day. Now, I would like us to watch our report about Russian myth, about propaganda, if you don't mind. Let's watch.
Russian politicians and the Kremlin's propagandists are desperately trying to persuade the whole world that Crimea is Russian territory. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 is characterized by Russian propaganda as historical justice.
Knowing the history of Crimea is enough. Knowing what Russia meant for Crimea and Crimea meant for Russia.
But Russia is not the first country that has ties with the Crimean Peninsula.
Russian ownership of Crimean Peninsula began in 1783 and ended in 1954 with some short breaks, when Crimea was under European occupation in the 20th century. That is just around 5.5% of Crimea's recorded history.
That means that Crimea was a part of Russia for less than 200 years. At the same time, the Crimean Khanate existed for more than 300 years, from 1449 until 1783, when it was annexed by the Russian Empire.
They came to Crimea claiming they are there to protect the Christian population and that Christians belong to the Moscow Patriarchy. Arianist Christianity was widespread in Crimea from the 3rd century AD. There was also non-Arian Christianity, which belonged to the Constantinople Patriarchy. Urums were the ones belonging to this branch.
If we look at old census records, we will, to our surprise, or maybe without any surprise, see that 95% of Crimea's population was Crimean Tatars, while ethnic Russians comprised, best case scenario, about 6,000 people.
Using forced migrations of Russians to the peninsula and repressions against the Aboriginal population, the Russian Empire tried to increase the number of the Russian-speaking population. Yet, Russians only became the majority in Crimea after the deportation of the Crimean Tatars from the peninsula in 1943. In 1945, Soviet authorities started changing its toponymy.
The Regional Executive Committee was obliged to continue its work by renaming settlements, railway stations, rivers, valleys, and other locations with Tatar names. District committees were obliged to eradicate anything Tatar and combat the use of any Tatar words and names.
This was the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR from August 21, 1945. Historic names, the evidence that Crimea is the homeland of the Crimean Tatars, disappeared from maps. Stalin's topographists were not very imaginative. That is why Karasu changed to Karasi, which means Kapers. Surin changed to Siren, which means Ilyak. There were also 4 villages called Molochne, meaning milky, 2 villages called Ivanovka, etc.
Without this state policy, without the encouragement of Russians to move to Crimea, without the encouragement of Crimeans to leave the peninsula in the 19th century, and without the deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944, Russians would never have become the majority on the peninsula. Saying that Crimea is some kind of primordial Russian land is not just supporting Putin's perspective, it is acknowledging your own ignorance.
But the Kremlin's propagandists are using tools tested back in the Soviet times. They are substituting facts, rewriting history books, and attempting to persuade everyone that their opinions are objective reality. They are using lies to cover up their crimes. Reported by Imran Husseinov, UATV.
Now, that's a lot of historical myth here, and the fundamental myth for people to understand is this idea that was behind the annexation of Crimea, that Crimea is Russian. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, I think that in your report it is brilliantly stated that Crimea is not Russian, historically talking about this issue, that really Russian Federation occupied and annexed Crimea only in the end of the 18th century, and before that Russian Empire and now Russian Federation had nothing to do with Crimea. So this is a very big historical myth. Unfortunately, Russian population uses this myth because of the Russian propaganda. But for me, the more important part of the story is the legal part, not the historical one. Because if we look at history, I mean, we will have, I think, 4 or 5 states in Europe. Because, I mean, there were times in history when different lands were lands of different states. And nowadays, in modern society, in modern current state of affairs, international law prevails. In international law states that in Europe, in the world, states do behave under the principles of territorial integrity, non-availability of frontiers or borders, and so on and so forth. So for me, it is more important not the history, but the legal part of affair. And under international law, Crimea is Ukraine. Russian Federation acknowledges this. Russian Federation acknowledged that it recognizes Ukraine as a sovereign independent state within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea. In 1991, Russian Federation worked with Ukraine in different international organizations, including the United Nations, and recognized that Crimea is part of Ukraine. So, under legal solution, under international law, Crimea is, of course, part of Ukraine. This is more important than historical part of the story for me.
So what you're saying is that Russia is contradicting its own treaty and the treaty it signed and basically the relations it has and had with Ukraine.
Well, yes, I mean after the Second World War, it is the current state of affairs in Europe and in the world that we recognize the states within their internationally recognized borders. And Russian Federation in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, recognized that Crimea is Ukraine and that Ukraine is a is an independent country. So really, in 2014, after the occupation of Crimea and the attempt to annexation of Crimea, of course, Russian Federation actually violated international law, all the general principles of international law, a lot of treaties, both multilateral and bilateral. And of course, Russian Federation contradicted its foreign policy, which existed before 2014.
Now, it also tried to hide it behind a so-called referendum in Crimea. If Russia is going to, let's say, annex and violate international law, why even bother doing a referendum there?
Well, of course, nobody in the world, I mean, no international organization, no civilized state will recognize this so-called referendum. And of course, all the international community recognize that Crimea is Ukraine, is part of Ukraine. So nothing changed in the legal status of Crimea under international law for international community. This is very important for us to understand that Crimea is not Russia, Crimea is Ukraine. This is the first issue. The second issue is that probably Russian Federation needed this so-called referendum because they didn't have another, let's say, tools to get a part of a territory of another independent and sovereign state. And by this so-called referendum, maybe they wanted to show that this is the will of people, the will of population who reside, who permanently live on this territory, so that if this is the will of the population then prescribes and makes independent state. You remember that there was a time for one day when it was the so-called independent state of Crimea, and then the other day it was like so-called included into the territory of the Russian Federation. So this was some kind of a technical tool for them. But again, we don't recognize this so-called referendum, and no other state in the world recognizes this referendum. And I think that today the president of Ukraine brilliantly stated that Crimea is part of the territory of Ukraine, and we will do all that we can to regain control over this part of our territory.
Now, about legal tools, Russia is also waging the tool of delivering passport, forcingly delivering Russian passports to citizens of Crimea. Can you expand on that phenomenon?
Well, of course, this is their policy after taking control over the occupied territory, the occupying power. Russian Federation started to give the passports to grant nationality to the people who reside on the territory of Crimea. And yes, the bigger part of population who reside now in Crimea, the majority, really do have two citizenship, both Ukrainian and Russian one. So of course this is a violation of the occupying power. Occupying power shall not give the nationality of the occupying power to the residents of the occupied territory. But more importantly, and I think that the more, I would say, vigorous and vicious violation of international law is that Russian Federation tries to change the ethnical map of Crimea, so that Russian Federation make pro-Ukrainian citizens, Crimean Tatars, other residents of Crimea who do not want to support occupation to leave the territory of Crimea, and then transfers the population from the Russian territory to the occupied territory of Crimea. This is the war crime, or the crime against humanity, which is called forcible transfer. Yes. So I hope that international fora, international judicial bodies will pay direct attention to this policy of the occupying power.
This demographic reshaping, as you said, is indeed a war crime. How to stop that? Because it seems to be a pattern for Russia to do that. When they annex the territory, they make people from this territory leave the territory and then put Russian there and then say, okay, it's Russian, because obviously people living here are now Russian. How to stop that kind of phenomenon?
Well, it's rather hard to stop such activities, such policy of the occupying power as any others. I mean, as any other brutal violations of human rights and other mass atrocity crimes, like, I don't know, let's say, forcible conscription to the army of the Russian Federation, which is the army of the occupying power, or other crimes like not providing fair trial rights to the people in Crimea. You know, we are talking about a lot of crimes against Crimean Tatars,
indeed, yeah.
Against pro-Ukrainian activists, and all other issues. So a lot of violations, and really a lot of them are mass atrocity crimes. But we see that since we are still in a position that occupying power still controls the territory of the occupied Crimea, all that we can do is to have international support for Ukraine in regaining control over Crimea. We can have sanctions, we can have international tension on the Russian Federation in order for it to stop this activity. We can have like resolutions of United Nations General Assembly, of Council of Europe working bodies, organs, of other international forums, international organizations, to make Russian Federation stop and cease such really, in many instances, criminal activity, really.
We will go further on the chapter of sanctions a little bit after, but right now, what's the situation if it's possible for observers and human rights watchdogs to go there? What's the situation of human rights watchdog there?
This is a very problematic issue. It was raised many times. The fact is that the only possibility to get the real information from Crimea, when we talk about human rights abuses, to have these human rights watchdogs, is to have field missions of NGOs, of non-governmental organizations, which of course will not be public, which of course will be the, let's say, secret ones. But this is the only position to get the information about human rights abuses, or to have the so-called civil journalism, when really people from Crimea who do want to find truth, they document or fix some violations and then correspond them to Ukrainian human rights NGOs, who then document them and give them to law enforcement agencies in Ukraine, or let's say then make a communication to the International Criminal Court. For international bodies, for international organizations, unfortunately for now it is impossible to come to Crimea. The very case is that Russian Federation officially says that it will let international human rights monitoring missions come to Crimea if they come to Crimea under Russian legislation. So through Moscow, through Russian so-called frontier. Of course, international human rights monitoring missions cannot do that because they recognize that Crimea is Ukraine. They cannot breach and violate Ukrainian laws and Ukrainian regulations. So they can enter Crimea only through Ukrainian checkpoints, Jongar, Kalanchak, Chaplinka, and the Russian Federation will not let them do this. So because of this position of the Russian Federation, unfortunately, neither UN nor OSCE nor any other international organization, human rights monitoring missions can now come to Crimea, unfortunately.
And it is indeed a risky job also to unveil what's happening to Crimean Tatars. Why, for the viewers to understand the situation, because the situation is a little bit forgotten in the media, in the Western media right now, why targeting Crimean Tatars for Russia?
Well, I think there are several perspectives or several, let's say, answers to this question. First of all, throughout the history, Crimean Tatars didn't want to recognize the Russian, let's say, sovereignty or Russian control over Crimea. So throughout history, Crimean Tatars had difficult relations with the Russian Federation, and now we also see that Crimean Tatars are in mass against the occupation, against the attempt to annexation of Crimea, so they oppose this. So this is the first issue. And the second issue is that really Crimean Tatars are very active in not recognizing this occupation and the activity of the occupying power and its bodies. So I think because of this historical perspective and because of the active position, unfortunately, really Crimean Tatars are the group who is the target of the most and the biggest part of mass atrocity crimes. And for instance, we know that there are more than 100 political prisoners kept in Russia and in Crimea, and plus 24 Ukrainian POWs, prisoners of war, women, Ukrainian military sailors. So 80% of all the political prisoners are from Crimea. And the biggest part of these political prisoners from Crimea are Crimean Tatars.
Now, the way the Russian occupiers, as you said, targets those Crimean Tatars is also targeting families, also targeting vulnerable people. I'm thinking also about children, the situation with children. Can we talk a little bit in general, not necessarily in details?
The problematic issue is that really occupying power target Crimean Tatars, and they target mostly men, and they do take men into prison, into jail, and so that the family is without the father. And it is a very problematic issue because, of course, somebody needs to feed this family. This is the first issue. Then the problematic issue is to come to the territory under control of Ukraine, I don't know, to Kiev, to Lviv, to Kherson, to Dnipro, because then you have problems to getting to Crimea because the father cannot give any document that he is okay with transferring children through the administrative line. So this is the problematic issue. And the other issue is that really in Crimea we had a lot of Ukrainian children, namely orphans. We had more than 4,000 of them in 2014. So this is also a problematic issue. What's now happening with them? Allegedly, we know that Russian Federation gave the nationality to many of them. Again, this is a violation of human rights, a violation of the Convention of Protection of the Rights of a Child. So I think we have a lot of work to do in this way.
Now, that was for the human factors, so to say. But one of the lines, coming back to the common line of Russian propaganda, when Russia annexed Crimea, it said that it could save Crimea, give Crimea a certain a boost in economy. Now, if I'm not wrong, Russia has lost, I got the numbers here, $150 billion over their 5 years of annexation. Is it sustainable for Russia right now?
I don't think so. That is sustainable and that this is profitable for Russian Federation to have the occupation of Crimea, because really it is not a cheap activity. Russian Federation needs to pay many billions of dollars for supporting this occupation. Before the occupation, we understand that Crimea was controlled by Ukraine, and Crimea could have foreign investments. Ukraine could have international investments from, let's say, World Bank or European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to come to Crimea and to work there. Now nobody will come to Crimea from the international community, so that it is up only for the Russian Federation to pay for this. And of course, this means that Crimea cannot become let's say, a prosperous project. And I think that Crimeans start to understand this, that under the Russian occupying power rule, they do not have the prosperous future.
It also has an incidence on ecology. In September 2018, we remember this catastrophe of Armyansk, which was covered by the Russian Federation, this explosion of a titanium plant, and which was first denied and then covered up by Russian Federation. Then there is also a lot of drought right now in Crimea. How long can this destruction of the ecosystem of Crimea and the Russian Federation system can last? Because they're basically destroying what they.
Well, yes, they are destroying ecology, the environment of Crimea. You actually named the Crimean Titan plant in Armyansk. It can happen anytime in future. I mean, nobody can say that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow we will not have the same situation as the year before. There are a lot of other plants which also can be dangerous. While building these roads like Tavrida, the main one, they are destructing forests and trees to make this road built. Also the issue of the so-called Crimean bridge or carriage bridge.
Yeah, the carriage bridge.
We know that it is also dangerous for ecology of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, especially the Sea of Azov, and the animals and fish who live there. So if we make the collection of the potential ecological threat, which is caused by the Russian Federation, it will be another portfolio of Russian Federation's violations.
Now, coming back to relations between Kyiv and Crimea, recently the occupation and reintegration of Crimea remains, Mr. Zelensky said, it remains one of the top priorities for the new government of Ukraine. What is exactly the current strategy to reintegrate the
Well,
Crimea?
this strategy is going to be made, is going to be drafted. You know that we have a decree of the President of Ukraine that the Commission for the Legal Reform is established. In this Commission for the Legal Reform, we have a working group on reintegration of the temporarily occupied territories. So I think that within this working group, we will work on the drafting of the strategy, of course with participation of any other interested stakeholders from the Cabinet of Ministers, from the Parliament, from NGOs, from expert society. So yes, this is a priority, and we shall work on this, I think, and start drafting this in the near future.
Now, on a more global scale, and let's say foreign policy scale, one of the topics of reintegrating Russia or not in G7 / maybe future G8 is reintegrating Crimea for Ukraine. Some countries took a certain side, others took another side. What's your take on that? How can foreign policy help, and let's say geostrategy, global geostrategy, help to reintegrate Crimea in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I do hope that Russian Federation will not let to join to any international fora, including G7 or potentially G8, without stopping and ceasing to violate international law. The situation with Crimea is a brutal violation of international law, which didn't happen in Europe after the Second World War.
Yeah, it was unprecedented.
So there was no attempt of annexing the territory after the Second World War. So that is why the international community, now civilized part of the international community, they like to play under the rules. These rules are general principles of international law. Nobody wants such an activity to be made again with their country. So that's why I think that this is a very wise position, that for the Russian Federation to join any international platform, they need to cease violating law, because only in this case we can talk with them. So I do really hope that international partners understand this, that Crimea is very important. And the other issue is that I do hope that we can move forward with international partners with the story of Crimea. I mean, not only saying that, not only stating the non-recognition of occupation or attempt to annex. We are very thankful and grateful for that international partners recognize that Crimea is Ukraine. But obviously we can do more. Obviously we can start negotiations regarding Crimea, even without Russian Federation in the beginning, because we understand the occupying power will not participate in these talks. Because this is very important. We do have now talks on Donbass. we do have Minsk format, we do have Normandy format. So Donbass is talked about in international discourse. Crimea is not.
Now, and to conclude this interview on one more personal note, as a permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, what is the next challenge? What kind of challenge would you outline right now? What's expecting you in the next, let's say, 5 years?
Well, first of all, I want to do my best to regain Ukrainian control over Crimea. Of course, this is a maximum task. It is not easy, but we are there to do that. And we do believe that we can do that all together, that Ukrainian flag, which is on your shirt now, it can return to Crimea. The other issue is that we want to draft, to be an active part in the drafting of laws and regulations, which will, let's say, help the deoccupation and reintegration of Crimea, and which would help people who do reside in Crimea or are internally displaced persons from Crimea to feel better in Ukraine. So if we can do something which will ease the life of people and which can help the occupation and reintegration of Crimea, I will think that our job would be successful.
So just one of these draft law might be in the beginning of the work of the parliament, which is going to happen soon, right?
Well, yes, of course. We do have already some draft laws which can be in the parliament rather soon.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk about the issues in Crimea right now. That was Anton Korynevych. He's a permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Now, thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.